Good Friday morning to you. Here we are at Good Friday. Today is the day in our church year and our Holy Week celebration as we get ready for Easter. Today is the day when we acknowledge the weight of our sin. It's hard to ignore it, as Jesus is nailed to the cross for our sake, for the sin that we carry. Our sin is ever before us. Today, as we engage in worship, we'll hear Jesus' last 7 words from the cross, and we'll focus on specific scriptures that are common to this day. But for this devotional, I want to focus on an aspect of Good Friday that we rarely talk about and we don't give a lot of time to. For this moment, I want to talk about Judas. Judas is one of the disciples that we don't know a lot about. We know that he is the one who carries the purse. He's the one who manages the daily finances, even though he's not the professional accountant, that of Matthew, who is the tax collector. For some reason, Jesus picks Judas, or maybe Judas volunteers to hold the purse. Throughout the Gospels, we hear little instances that maybe Judas isn't great with money, whether he is holding it for himself or maybe he's just really savvy and doesn't want to spend it on anything. Maybe he's just one of these people that isn't generous and isn't gracious. The Gospel of John goes as far as to say that Judas is a thief, but we're not quite sure why that is. There's all these little hints throughout the Gospels, but nothing concrete. Judas, in the midst of being one of Jesus' disciples, we know his story in that he betrays Jesus. He works out a deal with the temple officials, the high priests, that he would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now, there are some modern theologians in the last 50 years who have suggested that maybe Judas thought he was helping Jesus' mission, that he was bringing about the kingdom of God in a quicker manner than Jesus meant it to be, that his intention maybe wasn't completely wrong, that maybe he did have good intentions. It's kind of an interesting thought when you think about what Judas is doing. But regardless of his intentions, he does something bad. He betrays Jesus. And so we know in the Gospel of Matthew that when they're celebrating the Passover, Jesus identifies that one of his disciples is about to betray him. They all ask, "Is it I?" And Judas is the last one to ask. And Jesus lets it be. Yes, you know you're the one who's going to betray me. We know this part of the story. It's interesting because Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, he says at this moment, it would have been better had he not been born. I've always thought about that line. I've always thought about why Jesus might have said that. It would have been better had he not been born. So Jesus is betrayed. We know this. He's arrested by the high priest. He's brought before the Sanhedrin. That's the Jewish officials. And as he makes his way through the night, that is Maundy, Thursday, into Friday morning, something significant happens. And it happens in chapter 27 of Matthew. It says, "When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor." Now listen to Judas' reaction. This is verse 3 of chapter 27. "When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, 'I have sinned by betraying the innocent blood.' But they said, 'What is that to us? See to it yourself.'" I wonder about Judas, his intentions. I like the modern theological understanding that maybe Judas was just trying to help God, that his intentions weren't as it put into motion. Jews, the high priests, the chief officials of the temple, had no right to kill. It was against Jewish law. They could flog, and they could beat, and they could cause all sorts of problems, but they had no right to put to death. In fact, that is why Jesus has to be taken from the high priest and the Sanhedrin and turned over to a Roman official, because it's only Rome that is allowed to put to death. You think about that. As Judas is watching this, maybe he has it in his mind of how Jesus is going to be triumphant, how Jesus is going to put them to shame, how Jesus is going to finally be the voice that Judas knows he can be. And yet he's beaten, and then he's turned over. He's condemned. Judas knows that the minute Pilate has him, the minute the Roman officials have him, they will punish him. They'll punish him as a criminal. They'll punish him as a traitor to the civil society. It'll be humiliating. And Judas can't stop it. I think of the weight of Judas' sin. Judas tries to return the money, and the high priests laugh at him. He tries to return it, and they scoff at him. What is it to us? In the Gospel of Matthew, we read that Judas leaves that place and hangs himself. The weight of his sin is unbearable for him. The weight of his sin is so much that he cannot sustain his life any longer. It's crushing him. I think about that. I think about as Jesus made his way to the cross, as Jesus suffered and died, he died for each of us. He died for you. He died for me. He died for all of the sins that we engage in, whether we realize we're doing it or not. He died for us when we think we're helping God and we put into motion things that we can't possibly fathom. He died for Judas. And unfortunately, Judas didn't allow Jesus to speak into him. Judas couldn't see the forgiveness that was about to be before him. And he took things in his own hands. I wonder if that's why Jesus says it would have been better had he not been born. Because of the weight that he would carry, because of the crushingness of his sin that would be too much for him. I wonder sometimes, as Jesus forgives the man on the cross and promises him paradise, if it's somewhere in that Jesus doesn't open his arms and welcome Judas as well. See, I don't know, and you don't know. And there's a lot of speculation about what that happens, what that transaction looks like, especially when we talk about things like suicide. But on this Good Friday, I want you to consider Judas for a moment. Consider the weight of his sin. Is there any aspect of your life that you are allowing it to crush you? Is there an aspect of your life that you just feel like you can't bring it before God, that God won't forgive it? Is there anything you're holding on that you are just too ashamed of? Because I think that's the greatest shame about Judas' life, is that he couldn't forgive himself. He thought that Jesus would never forgive him, so he couldn't forgive himself. And he punished himself greatly for it. I'm reminded on this Good Friday that Jesus goes to the cross, but also goes to the grave. He knows the depths of depravity. He knows the darkness of darkness. He has not been anywhere that we won't go. And in all of that, Jesus meets us. He meets us in our suffering. He meets us in our sorrow. He meets us in our sin. I hope it is a Good Friday for you.